Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to you lovely folks joining me here nice and early over at HowlingMines. Thank you very much for checking out the content here. Hopefully you'll have a fantastic time and all is well in your world, much like it is in mine, and hopefully it is in the world of Flesh and Blood. Now, full disclosure, this deck tech is being recorded before I begin to travel to the Flesh and Blood World Championships. My flight leaves in a few hours, and I wanted to do my best to get this information available and on YouTube, and hopefully scheduled to release during Worlds. Fingers crossed. But we'll have to wait and see whether or not I get there. My plan here is to break down my Blitz deck, my thoughts and my rationales in this video, which, as you can see on screen already, I am playing Briar, Warden of Thorns, and also my classic constructed deck, which will be available on the channel for where I am playing Icelander Stormbind. So I want to break these down for you guys that are going to be looking for lists heading into Dynasty and wanting to understand what the thought process was of players who were going to play Worlds. And hopefully, in hindsight, this is going to be, a good story if I do well at the event, fingers crossed, for which, Lord knows, I hope I do. So, first of all, I suppose, why Briar, Warden of Thorns? In this case, just Briar, I suppose, because we're playing the young version. Not a super popular deck in Blitz, but I'm going to lead this off by saying I have a very regimented thought process about how Blitz is supposed to be played. And you'll find any deck I play in the format regularly is built around the concept of turn 0 power cards. And what I mean by that is Blitz is a very powerful format. Things are way above rate because both players only have 20 life to work with. Meaning that your cards, that everyone matters a lot more. And the average power level of your average card also matters a lot more because the early turns feel so impactful. So when I build decks in Blitz, I look to build lists that can play as many cards as possible that are completely insane on turn 0 of the game if you're going first, or turn 1 of the game if you're going second. Because I want to maximize my high roll potential, basically every deck that I play. And this has been successful for me so far. If you go back and look at the Lexi deck that I top 8'd the Battle Hardened Leads with, in Viserai format, you'll see that that deck was all about exactly the same thing. It was about leveraging 3 of a kind, Art of War, Rain Razors, these ridiculous high power cards that you can build a deck around and try and draw them as consistently as possible in the lower deck, lower life total format. And I think Briar is not only a linear aggro deck which can have ridiculous draws, but I think it is really the best aggro deck into a deck I expect to see a fair bit of, which is Oldhim. I think Briar has some tools to outpace Oldhim that decks like Fi and sometimes even Chain don't necessarily have access to. I do think you also get to play some cards that people have forgotten about and aren't necessarily respecting. And I think you can also just jam in one of the highest amounts of these turn 0 power cards that I keep referring to. And so I'm going to walk you through this, kind of explain the rationale real quick. And hopefully in hindsight this looks really good. So in terms of stats for this deck, for people that care about that kind of stuff, this deck is balanced exactly 20-20 on non-attack actions and attack actions. I'm on 28 reds and 12 blues. 12 blues means that I should have a 1% chance of a 4 blue hand, and 28 reds, a 1% chance of a 0 red hand, which is kind of numbers that we're looking for in this case. And that 20-20 ratio, important for Runeblades, of course, trying to play both to turn on Rosetta Thorn as consistently as we can. And also, this deck contains Sonata Arcanics, which means that count matters even more in terms of how important that is in ratios. So this deck here, unfortunately Fabry, not the best for sorting stuff like this, but I'm going to break it down card by card as we go, kind of explain the ones that I think need explaining, maybe explain some omissions, and then look at the armor suite afterwards. So to kind of cover all these earth cards in one go, you'll notice that we have 12 blues as previously mentioned, and you're going to see that 2, 4, 6, 8 of those are earth cards to facilitate Channel Mount Heroic. That is most of the reason why most of your blues have to be earth cards, is so that when you play Channel Mount Heroic, in this case, it stays around on turn 0 as often as possible, and of course at any point in the game as well. So I think you need a minimum of 8 to make that functional, in my opinion. And so the selection gets pretty cheesy. I'm pretty sure you always have to play Autumn's Touch because it is the only blue Earth block 3, so it always makes the cut. The other ones, I think there's a bit more wiggle room. I tend to lean more towards the cards I think make all blue hands more playable and or block better. So Earthlore Surge is very strong at making your hands that are like 2 to 3 blues function because it's a reasonable effect that you're happy to pay for in those spots, and that's kind of why it gets the nod. In terms of the other ones down here, Tome of Harvest is what I call like a pseudo high roll card. We're going to get onto some of the turn 0 cards I'm referring to very shortly, and while Tome of Harvest isn't a turn 0 card, it can kind of replicate that kind of power level if you're going first on turn 0 and your first turn of the game you have a card in your arsenal. And it can let you do some very silly things in spots like that, which is why I think it gets the nudge. I think Weave Earth is arguably the weakest Earth card in the deck, in my opinion. I was very close to playing Amulet of Earth over this for another 0-cost card that could potentially have some upside on big combo turns. But I think this blocking is relevant in Blitz, even though it only blocks for 2 and or 3. And it being a 0-cost non-attack action does come up in spots where you need to make an Embodiment of Lightning token. It does currently get the nudge over Amulet of Earth, but it was kind of close. It was definitely something I was testing up until the last minute, and that's kind of why that is there. So there is your 8 Earth cards I think you have to play. Your other blues, Force of Nature, shouldn't really have to explain this one, hopefully. Force of Nature is a ridiculous power card and definitely a reason to play Briar. Not quite as good on turn 0, but obviously it blocks 4 with an embodiment, and it is a 0-cost blue non-attack action that can draw you cards. It is really kind of insane, and there are plenty of ways in this deck to get your normal attacks above their base attack, so no way you weren't playing this. The last blue, however, is 2 copies of This Round's on Me, and this is what I mean by a turn 0 power card. So at the absolute bottom of its playability, This Round's on Me is a blue block 3 that can be a block 4 when you have an embodiment in play, which is great anyway. That's a fantastic rate for a blue that you're happy to have in your deck. This is fantastic in the aggro mirrors, so that you can, make Fi, make Chain, pressure you for less on their first turn of the game, given that when you play this on turn 0, you'll almost certainly be throwing some damage after it, so your opponent won't get to keep that extra card. They're going to block out and draw up to 4 anyway, or take a boatload of damage to keep a 5-card hand, both of which you're okay with, because their attacks will be smaller. And that's kind of exactly what I mean about it being a turn 0 power card. You play this to start with on turn 0, there is no downside. It is always going to make your opponent's first attack worse, their entire turn worse on the first turn of the game. They're very rarely going to keep an extra card without taking boatloads of damage. This is cheap enough to be able to play alongside another non-attack action to create an Embodiment of Lightning. I think it's all upside. I think it's all gravy. I think the card's very good in Briar, in Blitz, and even more so on turn 0, which is why it is my only non-Earth, non-Force of Nature blue card in the deck. So taking a look at some of the more red line cards in this case, Bramble Spark, pretty obvious inclusion. Arguably one of the worst cards in the deck, which is kind of weird to say for a card like this. Only blocking 2 kind of requires an Earth card in your hand to actually be on rate. When you're playing Briar, you really want all your cards to be worth a minimum of 4 damage, because that's the rate we're looking for. You'll see a lot of 0 for 4s in this deck. And Bramble Spark, a lot of the time when you don't have an ARF card, can be a 0 for 1, which is really kind of crap. But of course it's a 0 for 4 when you do have the Earth card, which is great, and that's fantastic on rate. So you see a lot of people playing cards like this, and maybe even revel in Rune Blood, that have similar problems, where they're 0 for 4s that take a bit of effort to turn on. I think Bramble Spark is the better one of the two, because the Arcane damage will create an embodiment for you if required. Arcane a little harder to handle for a lot of people in Blitz sometimes as well. And this is just, at the very worst, a 0-cost non-attack action that is going to help turn on your Go Again from Embodiment of Lightnings. That makes it good enough to make the cut. Channel Mat Heroic is the deck, the deck's linchpin. It is the reason to play Briar. This card is absolutely batshit insane, and it's even more so insane in Blitz, because you just regularly present 21, 28, or even 35 damage turns. When you manage to land this early, arsenal a card, use your armor to soak up your opponent's hits, and then jam the gun in their face with all these 0 for 4s that you can generate Go Again for. Card's nuts. Coax of Commotion is a interesting one. Not a lot of people are fans of this card. Some that are, though, are very loud and vocal about it. At the very worst, it's a 0 for 4. We're looking for a lot of those. You'll see that as we go forward, 0 for 4 is the rate we are looking for on all of our attack actions where possible. Coax doesn't have natural go again, but it does play very well with Snapdragon Scalers, and it can give you a quicken token to make your next attack gain go again if you failed to find an embodiment. This card gets the nod for me because of the draw a card mode for the most part, because on your Channel Mount heroic turns, your average card could be worth 7 damage, and your opponent's extra card being drawn is usually worth 3 to block, so it ends up being like a 0 for 7 base that can then do an extra 4 damage in exchange afterwards on your Channel Mount heroic turns. And that's the mode you'll find yourself using the most in spots like that. And that makes Coax good enough, in my opinion. Command & Conquer is definitely a strange one. Not a lot of people expected this in Briar. I think Command & Conquer is a bit better in Blitz. There are less Crown of Providences and more relevancy to the arsenal. Because people are trying to set up these big 5-card hands to do silly things that are very, very hard to handle in this high-roll centric format. And for me, I wanted a 2-cost attack in the deck that I could play off Ether Ironweave. Ether Ironweave is a card that you'll see in the deck a little bit later on. And we'll go into why that's our chess piece of choice when we get to it. But it generates 2 resources for you when you crack it. I wanted a big attack that could benefit me if I wanted to crack Ironweave for an attack at the end of a combat chain. And I think Command & Conquer is the best one of those. Worst comes to worst, it blocks 3, which means it is a reasonable attack in that rate as well. And niche corner case scenario, it is a 6-power card in a deck that does not have very many of those, which means it does have some value into Dramai and Prism as well, so that's definitely worth considering, and it's why CNC gets the nudge. Enlightened Strike, I probably shouldn't have to explain. E-Strike is batshit insane. It is one of the best generic attacks ever printed, so hopefully I don't need to rationalize that one too much. Exude Confidence, a card here that, oh, what an absolute house. Again, at the very worst, 0 for 4, which is great. But this deck is very adept at giving it go again, of course, which means it is often much better than that. It lets you burn extra blues that are stuck in your hand for no value, especially in matchups where you can't wear Grasp of the Arknight. And of course, the biggest reason to play this card is it's just insane against Oldhim and other defense reaction heavy decks. You just get to set up scenarios where you get to be like Nimbleism or Plunder Run or Channel Mount Heroic or Bramble Spark into Exude Confidence for 7, and suddenly they can't use defense reactions for the entire turn. And it's so crazy. You'll find yourself pitch stacking these against Fatigue Oldhim to try and set up those turns where you can just juice them for 21 damage plus an Exude Confidence at the start. Give and go again by an embodiment or your Snapdragon Scalers so that the entire combat chain is just safe from defense reactions, and that's just an effect you need to have in your deck. And when paired with Command & Conquer, it gives you a lot of staying power to get through defense reactions in the more sticky matchups. Card is fantastic. Definitely recommend playing it in Briar. Lightning Surge, unsurprisingly, a remnant of Cheerios Briar, the only lightning card you see in the deck, truth be told. Just a 0 for 4 that has natural go again if it comes out of the arsenal, and it's pretty easy to arsenal this thing in a pinch. Just great on rate. That's the reason you play it. Nimbleism. I actually think Nimbleism is kind of like Bramble Spark, arguably one of the worst cards in the deck, but you do need a concentration of 0-cost non-attack actions to make Embodiment of Lightnings and to turn on Rosetta Thorn. Nimbleism is the next best one. It is a 0 for 3 in a lot of cases, but because we're obviously playing so many 0 for 4s, it creates awkward breakpoints on relevant on-hit triggers for our opponent by sending in Coax of Commotion or Snatch for 7 in spots where those hit triggers really, really matter. And that does give it the nudge. But if you want to talk about cards that are insane that people forgot about, Plunder Run is, of course, up next. This card is banned in CC for a reason. I have no idea why it's still legal in Blitz. It creates horrible feel-bad scenarios where, Channel Mount Heroic turns happen and it's 7/7/7 and your opponent can just never stop you drawing with Plunder Run to come in for another 7. It is ridiculous. It's just possibly one of the best non-attack actions ever printed. And while it's legal in Blitz, you should probably be playing it, truth be told. Ravenous Rabble, again, just a 0 for 4 in nearly all circumstances. No Gorganian Tome in this deck, mostly because the card doesn't block, which I think is a super, super no-go in Blitz where possible. But most of the time, this deck is 28 reds, 0 for 4, with natural go again, which is obviously something that a lot of the other attacks can't say for themselves. Yeah, basically the reason it sees play in Briar has done since the beginning. Same said for Scar for a Scar, 0 for 4 with pseudo go again, because you're going to be taking damage a lot of the time to set up these big combo turns. Makes a lot of sense. Snatch, again, just 0 for 4, able to give it go again, off of embodiments and Snapdragon Scalers, draws you cards, hits on awkward breakpoints. Plays very well with all these extra buffs. Great on the end of a combat chain. Card's great. Unsurprisingly, we are playing it. Sonata Arcanics. This is one that me and my team disagree on. And I'm playing it, and I don't think all of them are. Again, we kind of talked about this earlier. My mythos is power cards on turn 0. And Sonata Arcanics is one of those. Because it lets you leak arcane damage on turn 0 that your opponent won't be happy to prevent, especially if they're only bringing AB1 because you're Briar and not like a wizard. So if you can pitch blues into this on turn 0, you can do some silly things where you just deal like 2 to 3 arcane damage, your opponent can't stop it all. You can play another non-attack action, play an attack with Go Again, Rosetta Thorn to leak even more arcane damage. It's so good early, and at the very worst, it is a 0-cost non-attack action that makes you an embodiment of lightning and draws you a card in most spots. Again, we're equally balanced in the deck 2020, so we are about as likely to hit on Sonatas as we possibly can, which makes a fair amount of sense. I do understand the rationale that the card is very random, even though pitch stacks don't matter so much in Blitz, and you will just miss sometimes with, and the card does like no damage. Even when you hit, the card itself is arguably worth 1 damage. But it's not really 1 damage for a card because the card is replacing itself, which means it's 1 damage for 0 cards in a lot of spots. And all of that kind of tied together is why I think it's good enough, but I do understand why a lot of people aren't about this card, especially with no Bloodsheath Scalia. Swarming Gloomveil, 0 for 4 in a lot of situations. For a lot of people that aren't aware, the embodiment you make when this hits counts towards its thing. So you can pretty easily make this a 0 for 4 via embodiments of Earth, Lightning, Rune Chance. But at the very worst, it's a 0 for 3 with upside. And it's a reasonable red attack that happens to block 3. And not a lot of your 0 for 4s do block 3, which makes it good enough. So that is the last card in the main deck here that we need to explain, truth be told, for this list. We're going to start looking at the armor selection here. Now, most of this is going to be pretty self-explanatory, I think. But we'll explain some of the other 11. There are other options in Blitz because you get to bring so much equipment. So we'll break down some of that and the matchups they're going to be for. Rosetta Thorn, card is stupid. Possibly the best weapon ever printed, unsurprisingly. We're using it in this deck. Aether Ironweave is the chess piece of choice in most matchups. The reason for that, we don't have Bloodsheath Scalia anymore, so we don't get to block quite as well. And I think this is the highest upside chess piece overall. Games don't often go long enough to get 2-unit counters in most matchups. And you can block with this, get your block value, and then pop it for resources to swing a Rosetta at the end of a combat chain you wouldn't be able to otherwise, making it worth 4 damage. Or, of course, in those real upside scenarios, you get to pop it to pay for, like, CNC, or something like that, so it comes in for 6, and it's really, really solid in those spots. So, chess piece that blocks, that has upside, that's why it makes the cut in most matchups. Crown of Providence, Grasp of the Arcanite, just the best pieces of armor you can be wearing on your head and your arms that block the most. Like, unfortunately, Blitz, again, is just all about blocking, and when you're trying to set up these big, stupid combo turns with Briar, you're going to have turns where you use your armor to keep you cards in hand so that you aren't taking too much damage, and these are just the best for doing that. Crown of Providence is really good at fixing blue heavy hands, or if you have to Arsenal a card that you don't particularly care about, really solid at that as well. Snapdragon Scaler is just the best foot piece for a deck like this. You can't always make an embodiment of Lightning, so having that get out of jail free card to gain Go Again is very strong. And for the most part, you'll need to use this on your Channel Mount Heroic turns when you draw 2 0 for 4s that don't naturally have Go Again, so that you can push ridiculous amounts of damage on Channel Mount Heroic turns. So you keep them for that as best you can. The other 6, we have access to AB2, and for the most part, AB2 is what we want against Icelander, which is more than fine. We have that in the form of Crown of Dichotomy and Vexing Quillhand. 2 fantastic pieces of AB, tend to be the ones that we're interested in playing in that matchup, because we still want access to Aether Ironweave and to Snapdragon Scalers in those matchups. Ironweave blocking there actually surprisingly relevant due to all the Wounded Balls and similar, so it does come up, but we do want access to the ability to have AB2. I think you could probably get away with AB1, truth be told, for a lot of the Aether Ice Vein turns and stuff with Briar. But I was really close to trying to find space for AB3 because we're quite high on our blues in comparison to some other decks. So kind of split the difference because I think Vexing Quillhand is actually worth a decent amount in the matchup anyway, because it's so easy to split damage. Findle's Spring Tunic, basically mostly for Oldhim and occasionally for the more controlling versions of like Dromai. and other control decks that you might find in Blitz. Just games that will go longer than 3 turns. It ends up often being better than Aether Ironweave. I don't think it's particularly great into Iyslander though, because in my experience, those games actually don't go much longer than 3 turns, which is kind of sad to say. And the rest of the suite here you see with Spell Void 4 is mostly for Kano, truth be told. I don't expect to see an awful lot of Kano in the event going forward, but I think it's important that I have access to Spell Void 4 plus AB1. And now the reason for that is obviously when I'm playing against Kano, I really want to be keeping as many cards as I can and not paying to AB, because I need to be pressuring them to get them dead before they combo kill me. And in that world, I want the ability to prevent an Aether Wildfire without paying any resources, which is what the Cloak, the Leggings, and Shock Charmers let me do. So I can just prevent 4 on an Aether Wildfire without paying anything with any cards whatsoever. But I do also need to be able to beat Aether Wildfire if they pump it with Crucible or Node, and that's why I think it's important to have a piece of AB in that matchup too. And yeah, that's honestly most of it. I don't think you wear Quillhand in the mirror. I do think the block on Grasp for the Arknight is going to do you more benefit over the course of a game than Vexing Quillhand will. I think that's it, honestly. So yeah, nice, quick and stum, because obviously we don't have to go through sideboarding decisions in Blitz. But this is where I am. This is the Blitz deck I'm playing at Worlds. This is Briar, and hopefully it will have a fantastic record to report when all is said and done. So thank you for checking out the video, guys. Hopefully this deck is of some use to you. The link will be in the description box below if you want to export it for yourself and try it out. And hopefully it is successful for you. But until next time, I've been HowlingMines. You've been amazing. And hopefully I'll see you for some more Flesh and Blood content very, very soon. Have a good one.